Thank you. Good to see everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm going to pull up our slides here. So this is, one of our 2 monthly webinars. The one we had last week is more of a Q&A, new features, and so on. And the second one, the one that we're doing right now, it tends to be on, broader topics, maybe things that Derek and I have done research on recently. And so this is really a presentation about some of the material that we published on kitsis.com a few months back about forecasting in retirement income planning, and some of the results that we found in looking at different ways of forecasting, what kinds of forecasts, how they perform in comparison to each other and in comparison to what we would hope. And so although there are some statistics and things in this presentation, it's actually incredibly practical for people actually doing retirement income planning with real clients. So hopefully we can talk a little bit about that. And we have Derek here to talk about the places where this touches on his practice and maybe things that he's done to accommodate these findings. So, really since probably the 90s, we have used probabilistic forecasts in retirement planning. And what's a probabilistic forecast? It's really just saying, well, we don't really know exactly how things will turn out, but maybe we're not kind of 50-50 either. Maybe it's not a coin flip. Maybe we have a feeling, hey, it's more likely to be this or it's more likely to be that. And so we make these forecasts and they can help guide our decision making. But behind any kind of probabilistic forecast is the assumption that the forecast is accurate in some meaningful sense. So, for example, if we forecast that a retirement income plan has an 80% probability of success, and if you've been on our webinars in the past, or if you use Income Lab software, that we don't like to frame things in terms of success and failure. For many reasons, probably the most important being that's not actually the way that retirement works out. People don't succeed or fail, they adjust. But in this presentation, we will use that language since it is so common outside of Income Lab to kind of frame the discussion. So if you predicted an 80% probability of success, you'd expect that if you did that lots and lots of times, about 80% of the time, they would quote unquote succeed. You wouldn't want to predict an 80% chance of success, but actually have only 40% of those cases. If you kept, putting people on plans that had 80% probability of success, you would not expect 60% of them to quote unquote fail, right? That would be a really bad outcome. That's underestimating risk. But you kind of also wouldn't want to forecast, say, a 40% probability of success, but actually 70% of those people succeed. So that's underestimating risk, and which leads to probably giving advice that is overly frugal on the spending side, right? So we kind of want things to be roughly accurate. So how could you measure the accuracy of probabilistic forecasts? Well, weather forecasting is a reasonable analogy here. It's not perfect, no analogy is. But we could do a categorical forecast, say yes or no. Will it rain tomorrow? Yes or no. But because the world is messy and there's just too many things going on, we can't really hope for probabilistic forecasts to be the best we can do. And so we tend to go for probabilistic forecasts. So that's why on the weather channel, you'll get percentages. So if it doesn't rain tomorrow, which of these is more accurate? Well, the 75%, right? Versus being certain. What about if it doesn't rain tomorrow? Sorry. What if it does rain tomorrow? Again, offering kind of a low but non-zero chance of rain is better than saying, no, it won't rain, and then it does rain. Okay, so how can we evaluate probabilistic forecasts? What we do is we take the forecasts themselves, which are percentages, and we compare it to the actual outcome. So this shows a good model of rain forecasting. which is really just kind of, higher numbers. It predicts higher chance of rain on the days that it actually does rain, lower chance of rain on the days it doesn't, versus the opposite. The bad model is really getting things wrong here. And then what we do is we look at kind of the average error in the model, and the higher the error, the worse. Okay, so for those of you who are stats nerds, this is a Breyer score. It's the mean squared error. But all you really need to know is, ideally, we would have zero error, right? But that's when we're doing probabilistic forecasts, that's never going to happen. So we just want really low errors, and the higher the error, the worse the model is. There's another way to measure how good our probabilistic forecasts are, and that's using something called calibration. So again, this is saying, let's group together every time we predicted, an 80% chance of rain, and say, okay, on how many of those days did it rain? And if it was 80%, then you're perfectly calibrated. So the perfect calibration line is just the diagonal on this, right? If I group together all the times I said 90, and 90% of the time it did rain, I'm perfectly calibrated. Now, if I'm over this line, I have what we're going to call a wet bias, right? So actually here, in order to make it match probability of success, I'm showing this as predicting no rain, predicting dry days, right? Which is analogous to success, quote unquote, in retirement income planning. So above the line is a wet bias. I'm predicting more rain than there actually is. So I'm being conservative. Below the line is a dry bias, where I'm predicting things will be better than they actually end up being. And actually, in weather forecasting, it wouldn't be uncommon for us to have a wet bias, maybe even on purpose, because people tend to prefer positive surprises, right? So people aren't going to be as upset with you if you say it'll rain and it doesn't. That's just, hey, great. Versus you say it'll be dry, but it rains, right? You didn't bring the umbrella. Okay, so we're going to use those two tools, the kind of overall error level of the forecast, and there will always be error, and calibration to test different ways of doing retirement forecasting. And we tried to use models that are available or commonly used, so that, again, this could be really usable in your practice. So we have traditional Monte Carlo, which is by far the most commonly used approach. Reduced capital market assumption Monte Carlo, which just took our approach to traditional Monte Carlo and reduced the return assumptions. Regime-based Monte Carlo, which uses two sets of capital market assumptions, one for the near term and one for the long term. And historical analysis, which uses historical sequences of returns and inflation to model the situation. So in order to test forecasting, we have to have a completely systematic way of producing capital market assumptions in order to test them, right? Because we're going to be testing forecasts that would have been made in the past against what really happened in the past. So we can't cheat. We can't cheat by saying, well, I know what happened, so I'm going to create really good capital market assumptions. So this is how we did that, how we created them formulaically, no cheating, no putting your hands on the scale. So for traditional Monte Carlo, we created the capital market assumptions using the preceding 30 years of returns and inflation. Okay, so for each point in time, we looked back 30 years, took the average and standard deviation and correlations for that. For reduced capital market assumption, Monte Carlo, we just reduced that by 2%. And for all these, we're using a 60-40 portfolio. So if you're kind of wondering how large of a reduction that is, it's compared to a 60-40 portfolio. For regime-based, we used the approach that we actually use in the Income Lab software to produce our default capital market assumptions, which is we take all of history and then we filter out any of the periods that are least like each point in time from an economic standpoint. So think of that as inflation, PE, CAPE, things like that. So, unemployment. So we have a kind of a set of things to use as economic filters. And that's what we apply. For this study, we actually simplified it even more, and we just used CAPE. In Income Lab, we use a little bit more than that. And what we do is then we filter out, I believe for this study, it was half of history, and then using the remaining history, the kinds that are closest to each point in time, we use we produce two sets of capital market assumptions, one for the first 10 years, one for the remainder of the plan. And then for historical, at each point in time, we're just using all historical returns and inflation that's available up to each point in time. So all of this is completely formulaic. There's no opinion in here. And I think it probably, it's as fair as you can get for representing how producing capital market assumptions at each point in time could work. This is just a look at how regime-based Monte Carlo would apply, because this is maybe a little less familiar to a lot of people. So if you applied the near-term capital market assumptions to the first chunk, our default is 10 years. And actually, often capital market assumptions that are available to advisors really are more for like a 10-year period than a 30-year period. So we apply the near term, and then everything else is the long term. So again, not to belabor this point, but I think it's really important to understand what this study is doing. So let's say, for example, we're looking at forecasts that would have been made in June 1960. At that point, it's going to look at the 30 years preceding that point to create the capital market assumptions, and then it's going to forecast probability of success for the period after that. Right? And then we'll do it again for July. And now we have one more month in the preceding period, and we're pushing a month forward in the forecast period, then August, and so on. For regime-based Monte Carlo, doing a very similar thing, except now, because we're using all of history up to that point, but filtering it, in June, we have everything from 1871, which is when our data began, up through May of 1960. And then we move to July, August, and so on. And again, the filter is we're just excluding half of history, where CAPE is furthest from the value at the forecast point. So it's not, is CAPE similar to today? It's, in this case, is CAPE similar or not to August 1960, right? So it's always trying to recreate what would forecasting really have been like at each point in time. For historical, again, we're using all preceding historical returns and inflation, and then as time goes on, we're getting a little bit more data. Okay, so using that approach, how did these models perform? And again, the first way we measure this is with error, and a reminder is lower error is better, higher errors are worse. The way we kind of tested all this was we said, all right, we're going to take every monthly point from 1951 to 2002, and we're going to give each model 200 different systematic withdrawal plans from a 60/40 stock and bond portfolio. Very simple plans, nothing, it's just withdrawals. It's flat inflation adjusted withdrawals. We're not applying the SMILE or things like that we often people do in Income Lab. There's no Social Security or anything. Very, very stripped down, simplistic approach. Obviously, we would want to apply these to more complex plans as well, but it's often really useful just to start with something simple. And the 200 different systematic withdrawal plans are between very conservative, low withdrawal and higher withdrawal plans that we pre-baked them to be a range that was from extremely safe to extremely risky. And so this allowed these models to have a chance to say, oh, this one will be risky, this one will be safe, this one will be in between. The reason that it only went to 2002 was we were having it predict success or failure of a 20-year plan. So the last 20-year plan at the time that we did this work would have ended in 2022. So we couldn't go further than that. We did test 30-year plans as well, and then looked at the correlation between those results and the 20-year plans, and it was quite good. So we're relatively confident that these results extend to longer plans as well. The reason we started in 1951 was we wanted to give those approaches that needed a lot of history, we wanted to give them a good amount of history to be able to work with, right? It goes from 1871. So if we had started them in 1900, they would have had very few years to actually use in producing their model of the world. Okay, so what were the results? There was really a clear two sets of results. Traditional Monte Carlo and reduced capital market assumption Monte Carlo, which are by far the most commonly used approaches, had a lot higher error rates than regime-based Monte Carlo and historical. So there's a way of comparing these, and basically the two on the right had 25% lower error than the two on the left. So pretty large, pretty important difference here. What about calibration? Remember, this is about, hey, is the model particularly good in certain spots, particularly bad in other spots? Is it consistently above the line or consistently below the line, and so on? And probably because most people aren't, producing plans with a 10% probability of success, or at least following plans like that, we can just focus on the upper side of this. Where interestingly, the traditional Monte Carlo gets a pretty big dry bias, meaning it's underestimating risk, right? It's telling people, hey, leave the umbrella at home, it's going to be fine, but then it rains. It's actually interesting because on the lower end, which again, nobody's really using, it has a wet bias, but then in the important area, it goes to a dry bias. Regime-based Monte Carlo, on the other hand, which is the green line, consistently has a wet bias. So this is overestimating risk, meaning it's going to say, whoa, take the umbrella, take the raincoat, but then, more than is predicted, it turns out to be a sunny day. So it's overestimating risk. What does that mean for clients? In reality, or for advisors? Let's pick the predicted 85% probability of success. That's a very, and I think most people would agree, even though, again, at Income Lab, we try to reject this success failure framing as much as possible, but, for the purposes of this, I'll use it. If we looked at plans that had a predicted 85% probability of success, for every 100 people that were set off on their journey with one of these plans, the traditional Monte Carlo, you would have expected 85% of them to be fine, and 15% to quote unquote fail, which in our world means adjust downward. But in fact, 27 of them per 100 would have had to decrease spending over time because this was underestimating risk. So it was predicting 85, but in reality it was 73. For regime-based Monte Carlo, predicted 85. In reality, it was over 91. So we expected 15 out of 100 to need to adjust downward, but in fact, only 9 had to. So basically, under-promising, over-delivering for the green line for regime-based Monte Carlo, over-promising, under-delivering for the red line, traditional Monte Carlo. And I chose 85 both because I think most people would agree that's a reasonably strong plan, and because it's sort of a middling place for both of these. There are, obviously, you can see that these lines are quite jagged. So there are spots where they're closer to the line, spots where they're farther away. So this is just kind of one representative spot here. I think before we get on to the next point, and Derek, I think you have some thoughts on this. We'll come back to this wet and dry bias and talk about whether one or the other would be, preferable. Given that we know there are errors when you're making forecasts, what kinds of errors are better as an advisor and as a client? And I think most would agree that a wet bias, an overestimate of risk, under promising and over delivering is a better, safer way to go for the advisor and the client. And it also leads to better client experiences because, again, you're going to set out expecting that 15 out of 100 will need to adjust downward, but in fact only 9 will. And that probably also means more people will get pay raises than you had expected. So surprising to the upside. Okay, let's look at, go back to errors now. And I think it's interesting to look at not the entire time period all at once. Again, that was from the 50s to the early 2000s for when we're making those forecasts, but to look at them in rolling 5-year periods to kind of see, okay, are there environments where some models perform really well, some models perform really poorly, do they flip ever, and so on. And here we see our two worst performing models overall in the bold, in the orange and the red. That's traditional Monte Carlo and reduced capital market assumption Monte Carlo. They do have brief periods where the error is quite low, especially the reduced capital market assumption Monte Carlo, which kind of makes sense. Basically, if we look through these periods, so at each point in time, we're looking at the errors for the forecast that in the 5 preceding years. So in 1956, it's the forecast from 51 to 56. So we see through the 60s and into the 70s, reduced capital market assumptions did really well. Why? Because that turns out in retrospect that was kind of the worst sequence of returns for systematic withdrawals in the period we're looking at. Right. So, of course, having used lower capital market assumptions during this time would have been better. What we're seeing here is reduced capital market assumption Monte Carlo. It's a one-trick pony. It does well when things are going to turn out to be rough. Traditional Monte Carlo has a couple spots where it's low. You can see basically the late 50s. And then again, it does well kind of in the late 70s. The reason is it's always used in the preceding 30 years. And, the period in the 60s and 70s had low inflation adjusted returns. You can see everything did pretty poorly in the 80s because we were, the 80s actually turned out to be a really good time to retire because sequence of returns was going to be really good. None of the models got that quite right. But you can see that the historical and regime-based did not, kind of just rise to the moon on their errors. And overall, these two approaches did fairly well across periods, at least comparatively. You can see regime-based actually probably because of that wet bias, right? It's kind of over predicting risk in a lot of cases. It does really well through that worst period in this study from the 60s. And again, it actually does really well in the into the dot-com bubble area, probably because of that CAPE filter, right? So CAPE was really high, so it was predicting low returns. So we can see here that these two, historical and regime-based, are a little bit closer to being kind of all environment good performers, at least in comparison to the others that we looked at. So more consistent across a range of environments. And this is the thing, when we're doing forecasting, when we're doing retirement income planning, we don't really know what world people are going to live through. So we would like models that actually have a hope of doing okay, whether things turn out really good or really bad or somewhere in between. So what can we take from this? I think, there was a lot of stats in here, but let's back up. We tried to look at approaches to forecasting, approaches to planning, approaches to kind of, scoring a plan, seeing whether it was, really safe or really aggressive that people actually use. And traditional Monte Carlo, which uses one set of capital market assumptions, is certainly the most common way to do this. You could argue that our use of the preceding 30 years, is not representative of how people do this. And maybe that's true for you. We also looked at reducing those capital market assumptions, which I think a thing that a lot of people will do, especially on kind of some of those forward-looking capital market assumptions that you can find. They do tend to say, okay, let's reduce our assumptions going forward. Certainly, if we had a big database of the capital market assumptions that were actually made at each point in time, that would be an even better way to do this study. But I think the results here are fairly clear that traditional Monte Carlo, using one set of capital market assumptions and using historical averages, and reducing those capital market assumptions, really don't perform well compared to other options that are available. Probably the most commonly used of those other methods, at least in research, is historical analysis. So, like the Bill Bengen's work in the 90s that led to the 4% rule, that was all historical analysis. I think one worry people have often had about historical analysis is, hey, you're only looking at things that have actually happened. You're not looking at things that haven't happened but could happen. So this is, and fair enough, that philosophically certainly rings true and makes a lot of sense as a critique of historical analysis. But what really matters with our analysis, with our forecasting, with our planning is what would the actual impact on our advice and on client outcomes be, right? So this isn't about kind of some just purely academic discussion. It's what's the impact? And it looks like historical analysis, even though it's only using, what's actually happened, is actually still providing better, lower error rates than, traditional Monte Carlo, at least done here. Regime-based Monte Carlo has ever so slightly higher error rates across the board. Oh no, sorry, I'm wrong. Regime-based has lower error rates across the board, but again, this is a very small difference. We don't know for sure whether this will be sustained. And it provides a little bit more of a consistent error, meaning it's almost always, I think maybe truly always, erroring on the wet side, on the over-predicting risk, on the under-promising and over-delivering side. Whereas historical, you can see, is a little bit more of a mixed bag. It's the blue line here, so it stays a little tighter, but it tends to kind of go to either side of the perfect calibration line here. So I think Derek and I were both, somewhat surprised by these results, but also heartened in a way that there are ways of doing forecasting that improve on the status quo. So using historical, using regime-based Monte Carlo does reduce errors, by 25%, and that's truly important for these are consequential things that we're advising people on how much they can spend in retirement, what the chances are that they'll have to adjust, and so on. So really using models that have lower error, is kind of a no-brainer. I think probably maybe the most important conclusion here, though, is that no model was even close to being error-free. So these error rates or these error scores are high. To give you a comparison, if I was predicting rain, and I just always said there's a 50% chance of rain. Right, I'm just going to take I call it fence sitting, right? I'm sitting on the fence every day. That error rate would be 0.25. So that's essentially like, I'm not going to do any work. I'm just going to predict 50-50 on everything. Okay, I would get an error of 0.25. So these error rates are high. Reduced Monte Carlo 0.18. I mean, that's really bad. On these 5-year rolling periods, our error rates get far above that. We're just, the prediction is worse than just flipping a coin. So, and even with some of these better performing ones, regime-based and historical, they do get high occasionally, like in the 80s. So what do we do about that? This shows that we really can't, we can't just take our prediction probability of success, or, you know, in income lab, we think about it as risk and, you know, when would we adjust and so on. We can't just take those from the beginning of our plan and run with them and never come back to it, never adjust. This shows that the errors are high enough that we really need a plan for adjustment, a systematic plan for adjustment. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is just that we know that we will be wrong. We're going to try, you know, to use the best models possible to have the lowest errors, but we're going to need a hand on the steering wheel, right? So it's, you know, it's a little bit like driving down the road. You know, you might be able to go for a while just pressing the accelerator and hoping the wheels stay straight, but as things come up, as potholes come up, as, you know, little deviations in the road come up, you got to adjust, because now you're learning what road you're actually driving down, what adjustments are needed. And that's the other part of this is, as time goes on, let's say somebody retired in, I don't know, 1980. Well, things would have felt pretty bad at that time. They'd just come through stagflation. They didn't know when inflation was going to end. It really didn't wind down until a few years later, or start winding down. And so as time goes on, the planner and the model that you're using is learning more about what environment it's in. So it'd be very silly to go from 1980 to 1986 and not use, you know, what you've learned between 1980 and 1986 to improve your advice for a client. And so that's another reason that that it's not just about forecasting success and failure, or, you know, spending capacity and guardrails at the beginning of retirement. It's really important that it be updated over and over and over again as you learn more. Another way to look at it would be, you know, you could predict, you know, rain or not rain a week out, right? I just went camping with my family this weekend, and believe me, I was looking, okay, what's it going to be like? What's it going to be like? I was looking a week out, but I knew as we got closer, I was going to have better predictions, right? We were going to learn more about, you know, what the weather patterns were. And it would have been very silly of me to, you know, ignore the radar as we were, you know, driving into the mountains. That's new information. That's information that's crucial for planning. So I think if you're going to take one thing away from this, it is that not only do we need good forecasting models, the best that we can have, but since no forecasting model will be perfect, in fact, far, far from it, we need ways to update our models, update our forecasts, and adjust as we learn what's happening. So Derek, I wanted to, before we take questions, I wanted to kind of get your thoughts and input on what a financial planner with, you know, who's doing planning and retirement for clients, like what the takeaways would be for you and how it affects your processes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, I mean, it's really comes down to, you know, which model here do we want to use actually working with clients. I think I lean heavily and I like regime-based Monte Carlo or historical. I don't, you know, we've gotten into a lot of weeds here in terms of technical details. This is something I almost never discuss with clients. Like, this isn't something I'm really talking to them about, but in terms of, as a professional, selecting from different methods, what do I want to use? I think there are some, just on a practical level, I mean, one thing I like about historical results is that you are going to get more, you know, consistent between iterate as you update a plan, things like that. So that is one factor I consider, and one reason why I actually do kind of like historical. I think historical, if a client does ask, you know, what is this based off of, it's also easier to explain. You know, we're looking at actually, you know, kind of what you could have spent going through historical markets. You know, I think that's a little bit easier, just conceptually, than especially regime-based Monte Carlo, which is a fairly technical type of consideration. But I think, at the same time, if you certainly there's advantages to the regime-based Monte Carlo. I think the market we're in too can dictate some of that. Like, if you rewind the clock when interest rates hadn't risen, stock valuations were higher. That was probably an environment where I was definitely even more inclined to use a regime-based Monte Carlo, just given the environment we were in and kind of the unique risks. I feel like, that's maybe now that we've seen interest rates come up, we've seen valuation, we at least have a little bit of a dip there, right? That it's not as maybe doesn't feel like as unique of a time as it did before. But at the same time, all just finding that most relevant sort of market environment that we're in and projecting based on a short-term basis and then a long-term basis, that conceptually that makes a lot of sense to me too. So really, to me, it comes down to I want to use one of those two methodologies personally when I'm actually running a plan. But this is something I'm not. I'm just doing this internally as a professional. I'm not actually communicating much of this to clients unless they really want to dive into those weeds.
I think that's a really good point. This is like I don't know, a doctor choosing a blood test approach, or choosing a medical device, a replacement hip or something like that. There are, this is where kind of your expertise comes in to choosing the methodology. Occasionally it comes up, it sounds like, Derek, I don't know to what, if you have a guess of how often a client has sort of asked for more on where's this stuff coming from?
Very rare. I mean, for me, and it's even a lot of times if I do get a question, right? Because sometimes if you're presenting something and it feels too, kind of black boxy, somebody's just, where are these numbers coming from? To me, it's more like, what are the questions I get are more, what are the return assumptions, or, how does this, what's driving this? Certainly not down to the level of historical versus Monte Carlo versus regime-based Monte Carlo. Like, that's a level of detail I don't think I've ever had a client push me to. I'm sure there are some out there that would, but I just personally haven't ever run into that.
Yeah. Do you have when you're considering what to use? Sounds like you've used historical and regime based. What it sounds like one consideration there is, in particular, maybe when valuations were extremely high, when interest rates were extremely low, you liked to use regime-based Monte Carlo. Well, actually, before I ask my question, I wanted to bring up another example. I saw some people last year who were, I talked with them about plans that they were doing that had a lot of pension income that wasn't adjusted for inflation. And so those plans were really subject to inflation risk. And what we discovered was there really is something about regime-based Monte Carlo there where you can really express a risk or express an opinion in a way that you can't with historical. So they were able to say, well, let's really test this plan or produce a plan that assumes inflation will be high, at least at the beginning of the plan, which was important for these plans in particular, because if inflation was high, and it looked like it was going to be, that would really change how much someone could spend. So that was another place where, I guess it was a mix of the environment, because we saw inflation coming up, and the plan itself seemed to really have a weakness, which was that inflation risk. And so they were able to say, all right, let's make sure we can handle inflation risk because we think we will see it with regime-based. Whereas historical analysis will include high inflation periods, but it'll also include low inflation periods. It'll include deflation, right? So it's a really nice representation of what the world can be like, but it is not so focused on a particular risk or a particular plan. So I agree with you there.
Yeah. I think that's a good point on having the ability to maybe fine tune some of that, where with the historical record, it is what it is, versus being able to go in and actually express, here's a concern for this particular plan. You can be a little bit more precise or surgical in kind of what you're trying to look at with regime based.
Yep. I know when we were doing this, you also had some thoughts on this, wet bias or over predicting risk or under promising, over delivering. How important do you think that is for people, especially when you're giving ongoing advice rather than just point in time advice?
Yeah, it's something I try to balance because you don't want so much wet bias in the sense that you're telling somebody to spend way too little. I do think there is a certain degree that's nice to kind of have that positive, uh, or more likely positive income experience going forward. So I do think a little bit of that is nice. At the same time though, there's multiple ways to get at that. I mean, you can introduce a little wet bias even by shading your recommendation down a little bit or whatever that might be. But if you want to use the full power of Income Lab and kind of leveraging the software to automate a lot of that, that is something that I think is nice that you get with the regime-based Monte Carlo. I'm also comfortable with historical just kind of being in best guess in a sense. Like that doesn't cause me much concern. I do find it concerning when we see, particularly with the traditional Monte Carlo, actually having the dry bias. That to me is a real concern, because that's especially somebody who's not using a risk-based guardrails type approach, and that's particularly concerning when you're running a plan and targeting, say, 90% probability of success, and maybe not realizing that underestimation of risk is there. But for me, that's something I really want to stay away from. So I think a little bit of wet bias is good. Also okay with kind of hitting the mark, but really do like to stay away from that dry bias.
Yeah, it's a good point. Both are bad. It's just harder to see the cost of the wet bias is reduced standard of living, right? Which is that is a that is a cost. It's a really important cost. We tend to focus on the scarier costs, but you're right. Trying to hit it as close as possible probably is a good goal, at least. Okay, I think we've got a whole bunch of questions here. So I don't know if
That's right. I've been keeping track of them, so I've kind of broken them up into some categories here. But to first start off, just a reminder to our users that at the end of the webinar, we'll have that survey where you can give us feedback and also put in your CFP number, so that way we can get you the credit. But Derek and Justin, we had one great feedback, great presentation. Users are wondering if you guys are planning on writing an article on this topic, and as well as providing the slides afterwards.
Yeah, so I will drop the let's see here. How do I do that? Can everybody see the chat? I think I can change it to everyone. Okay, so here's a link to the article on this that that Derek and I posted on the Kitsis blog a little while back. So very similar content to here if you want to dive in. I also see some folks asking for the slides. Happy to make a PDF of these so we can send it out.
Okay, these first group of questions are around regime-based Monte Carlo. We had a few upvotes, and maybe Derek, you might be able to answer this. Just wondering, do the major planning software companies provide means to model regime-based, like Right Capital, Money Guide Pro, eMoney?
Yeah, I haven't done a recent check on the other software, but last I knew, I don't believe that's something that you can do in any of the major Monte Carlo platforms that are out there.
Gotcha. Great. And then next question here is just wondering, why do you use two sets of capital market assumptions in the regime-based Monte Carlo method?
Derek, do you have thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the whole concept there is really when you look at, what can we actually best predict with economic information? I think there's more evidence that shorter term window, right? We can kind of take advantage of, say, a 10-year period based on the current environment we're in to change our assumptions. But then you don't want to use that that short-term window long-term, right? Because we know there's going to be some reversion back to kind of the long-term average. So that's the conceptual idea, is basically take advantage of what we can say about the current market we're in. That's more going to be short-term. Longer term, we're going to get back to more what that long-term average would be.
Yeah, if you think about, maybe you had really low, bond return assumptions. And there's a big difference between assuming those will be with you for 5 or 10 years and assuming they'll be with you for 30 years, especially if you're heavily invested in bonds. So yeah, that's definitely the concept of having two different sets. I mean, you could certainly imagine a world where you had even more, but there's also kind of a practical aspect to this, and how much is to be gained by the extra work if you had 3, 4, 5 regimes. And I think the other point which Derek just made is, there are capital market assumption forecasts out there, and those don't tend to be for 30 or 40 years. They tend to be for 5 or 10 years. So really, there is a mismatch between putting those in for a plan, to use on plans that are longer than that. The way that it works in our software is, if you're using regime-based Monte Carlo, the first period of the plan will be covered by the first set. We call them near-term capital market assumptions. By default, that's 10 years, but you can change it. So if you had a plan that was 12 years, it would be, most of it would be using the near term. If you had a plan that was 30 years, most of it would be using the long term.
Just an interesting one. Do you guys know the inspiration behind the name regime-based?
I think my understanding of it is really it's just saying that there's multiple regimes, right? Periods that we're in of assumptions. So regime-based Monte Carlo being, 2 or more regimes instead of just using one set of assumptions.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like economic regimes or something like that is what the thought is there. I don't actually know who coined it. There's been a fair amount of, there's been sort of a popular tool in the research world. So I know Kitsis has written on it a bunch of times. I think Wade Pfau and there was a good article years ago. I'm trying to remember who co-authored that. Also looked at this kind of thing. It just hasn't been available to advisors until recently.
And speaking of that, we have a few folks who aren't Income Lab users, and they're just wondering, are all these methods available to select within the software?
They are, yeah. So we even do have a traditional Monte Carlo with one set of capital market assumptions. We actually use a 50-year average instead of a 30-year, but otherwise it's the same for our defaults. But you can always edit capital market assumptions. So yeah, all of them are available.
And then these next group are more about kind of communicating with clients. So, how would you recommend it be communicated to a client why using guardrails or dynamic distribution strategy results in such a significantly higher income level than using Monte Carlo? And if you have a few talking points here.
Yeah, for me, I'd say one first question that comes to mind is, what was the Monte Carlo plan itself shooting for, right? Because that could be part of the reason why you see different results depending on, if you're shooting for 99% probability of success, right? That's going to be part of what's driving that. But I think, if you're looking for just a really, quick, easy talking point, there is something to the fact that you can spend a little bit more with confidence if we know that the plan is to make adjustments when needed, right? That's the how I would kind of distill that down, because it does allow you to spend a little bit more if you're willing to make an adjustment. And this is, really actually a good opportunity for a broader conversation to look at something like the retirement stress test and take somebody through historical periods, show them what the downside was like and see if that's the right level of risk for them. Because somebody might, that's one thing you're not going to get with a traditional Monte Carlo simulation at all. Not a projection using traditional Monte Carlo. I'm just saying like a traditional Monte Carlo software. You're not going to be able to see what that income experience was like because there's no assumed adjustment. You're just going to charge forward blindly. But in this case, seeing, okay, if somebody actually followed that strategy, is this a reasonable level of downside risk? And if somebody's willing to make those cuts back, then that might be the right strategy. Or maybe you need to fine tune the strategy and dial in the risk level of the guardrails to make sure that matches better.
Yeah, I think that was another point about, we were saying, well, adjusting is important because we know that there will be errors, but adjusting is also important because it allows clients to, if it's appropriate for their kind of temperament, right, they can accept a higher chance of having to pull back in exchange for spending more. So, this is the income lab software. This spending level for this particular plan, which has all sorts of stuff in it, Social Security, a portfolio, all sorts of things. So, and that's what's producing this over $20,000 in monthly income. But really, there's a range. You could go more conservative, spend less today, and have a larger gap before you'd have to adjust, or you could say, no, I want to spend a lot more, but I have a smaller gap before I would have to adjust. So yeah, that is another real positive of planning with adjustments. Not only does it mean, as you learn things over time, you can kind of make up for your errors, right? Like maybe you didn't think it was going to rain, but then dark clouds appear on the horizon. Well, okay, we're going to adjust a little bit, but also it allows people to kind of match their spending to their temperament, to their risk tolerance.
And maybe just this kind of touching on that point a little bit, but one of our users was curious as to, is there a general ballpark range of how much higher spending can be in retirement using a dynamic strategy versus a static strategy, 10%, 20% higher, for example? And do you know if there's any formal or informal research done in that area that maybe an advisor can kind of get pointed to for the research?
I think it would depend on how much the plan depends on portfolio withdrawals. There is, using the SMILE, which this example plan I'm showing does, we know that tends to add, for someone in their 60s, that adds probably 15 to 20% spending capacity, basically because you're letting them spend, you're kind of stealing from late in the plan and putting it earlier, right? We're just kind of shoving it toward the younger years. So that's, I think, pretty well established that the SMILE does that. Now, that's not dynamic adjustment-based planning, that's just using the SMILE, but that's definitely a factor that people do enjoy. I don't know, Derek, do you have thoughts on that? I mean, once you know you can adjust, does it provide more spending capacity?
I think this is a situation where the unique client circumstances are going to trump any sort of generalized statement you can make, because depending on how much guaranteed income somebody has versus portfolio income, that's going to be a factor. What risk level they're using on their guardrails is going to be a factor. So for me, I rather than gut feeling says that maybe those aren't maybe 10% is not a terrible level that you might just expect to see, but at the same time, I don't even really give that much thought. I'd rather build out the plan and see for that particular client, what do we see, because there can be spending like Justin was talking about in terms of spending SMILE, but it could also just be somebody's goals. Maybe they have large goals at certain times that have unique circumstances for their plan. So I would really rather build that out and see what we get from there.
Yeah, it might come more into play if somebody is, if their plan is more of a reach, right? If somebody has lots of resources and they spend frugally, I'm not even sure it comes into play. Whereas if somebody is saying, I really want to retire, and this is how much I need, you could have a conversation with them that says, well, in order to do that, we're going to have to take on a little bit more risk that you are going to have to, pull back from that point. So just eyes wide open. Yes, we can do it, but understand there's a decent chance I'm going to call you and tell you it's time to tighten the belt. So maybe in that situation, it could give people some permission to try it out, to try out retiring. I could see that coming into play.
And real quick, are tax rates modeled into Monte Carlos?
They typically are. I mean, there's ways to do it with or without, but yes. Yeah. I mean, the reason I kind of waffle a bit is because let's take an IRA, for example. The withdrawals you can take, the risk of a withdrawal rate from an IRA does not depend on your tax rate. right? Like your IRA doesn't care what your tax rate is. What it will sustain in withdrawals does not care what your tax rate is. So if taxes go down, you'll be able to spend more of it, but you won't be able to take more of it at the same risk level. So the interplay of taxes and risk in retirement is unfortunately not like just perfectly easy and clear.
And just to jump in there, if the question there was getting at more just like, does the income lab take taxes into consideration? Absolutely, that's there. So that is something to be accounted for.
We do have quite a few questions. Just want to point out most of these, it looks like they're about getting the slides. So as Justin mentioned, we'll get you guys the slides PDF form and a follow-up. And I think you did drop the link in here as well. But maybe this last one while we have 2 minutes, just some questions on, is Income Lab only designed for the distribution phase of retirement? I know we get that question a lot. Maybe Derek, Justin, you guys can maybe use our last few minutes to kind of help our new folks maybe understand that piece.
I'll jump in with my take on that question, I guess. In my opinion, certainly there's, a lot of really practical application for somebody who's in or approaching that distribution phase of retirement. There are ways that I still use it with accumulators. So if somebody wants some sort of projection, kind of what income trajectory they might be on, and I don't, running projections for somebody in their 30s, there's so many assumptions there that it's almost not that useful in my opinion, but somebody wants some of that. I do think it's still better than running a Monte Carlo simulation for somebody early on. But then particularly getting into Life Hub, that's an area where I could have a lot of different things that I'm doing with somebody who's more of an accumulator and farther off from retirement, just in terms of touching in, making sure we're covering everything's up to date. Have that all information, have that all captured, but then also some of the projection capabilities and saying, you're on track to pay off your mortgage at this time, or here's the date, here's where we can kind of project some account balances out. Things like that, I do think are very useful for somebody outside of a traditional retiree.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would say the actual, what can you spend and what would make that change and what would the change look like? That is typically more useful close to at and in retirement. I think of it as a GPS. So like, when would you find, starting up Google Maps or Waze to be useful when you're going on a trip? It's not necessarily just as soon as you get in the car. It might be hours before, right? But it's probably not months before.
Perfect. All right, guys. Thank you. We are up on our time. To all of our users, thank you again for joining today. As I mentioned, again, please fill out the survey. We'd look forward to hearing your feedback and making sure you get your CFP credit. For the folks we didn't get to your questions, feel free to reach out to us in the survey too. You can request a one-on-one meeting, and that's a great time to get to know the software, have any questions answered, and see a demo as well. And then please be on the lookouts for our next webinar next month, that we will be sending out the invite to that as well. Justin and Derek, as always, thank you guys for the time and effort you put into these webinars. You'll see in the comments that we had a lot of folks just saying really great presentation and sharing a lot of good feedback. So I want to make sure you saw those as well coming in. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We will send the email out tomorrow with the recording. So you will see that in your inboxes tomorrow. Have a wonderful day and take care.
Everybody.
Thanks, everyone.